first human studies on biodiesel that have been done. So a little bit about air pollution to begin with, because I don't know how much people know about what we have for background in air pollution. So the beginnings of the science of air pollution began in the Meuse Valley in Belgium, and there are three significant happenings during the early 1900s that actually led us to start thinking that the air around us was something that was affecting our health. So Meuse Valley was the first time they started thinking about that industrial waste in the air and air pollution was something that was actually connected to people dying. And one of the things that started in 1930 was that cows would just tip over in the field and die. And they were wondering if this was some sort of disease. So they started, the veterinaries were actually the first ones who were looking into this. But then they started noticing that people were coming into the hospital. And within a couple days, 60 people were dead. So what had happened was there's factories all along this little valley, and they had an air system that came in that trapped it all. So all the newspapers were reporting this, and then the doctors and scientists in the area were thinking, well, as soon as this cloud went away, the hospitalization stopped. So it's the first time they really thought about it. Then Donora, Pennsylvania in 1948 happened. And it is said to be one of the worst environmental disasters in the US because of the localization of it. This was a place where US Steel had most of their iron and steel mills. So you can see this was mainly what was going on in Donora. It also was like the Meuse Valley, so it had an unfavorable geography for when warm air would come in, it would trap it. Now, Donora got so bad during this time that you couldn't see. So everybody was kind of confined indoors. And there was one local country doctor who went around with the sheriff. And he wanted to see how people were doing in this environment, and found more and more and more dead people. They were saying if this had continued a couple more days, the death toll would have probably been in the hundreds. In order to get from house to house, this doctor had to drive with the car wheel against the curb so he could even find the road. So, and the only thing that they brought around, since they had no idea what this was going to cause or why people were getting sick, they had oxygen tanks and whiskey. So everybody in every household that was feeling poorly got a little bit of oxygen and a big shot of whiskey. And they just kind of hoped this would save them through the episode. But as soon as the air cleared, yet again, the death stopped. So this was really starting to become clear that when industry and geography and weather kind of got together in unfavorable conditions, it was quite deadly for the human population in the area. But the biggest one is in London in 1952. And this is also weather related. There was a large warm air front that came in, and the wind almost completely stopped. And they got a cold front right on top of that. And in England, it was due to that people were using coal smoke in their homes. So this was an incredibly particulate mass that formed as fog. And here, it became so incredibly clear when looking at it that when the particles went up and when the sulfur dioxide went up, the deaths followed right along with it. Over 4,000 people died within 4 days in London because of this episode. So you can ask, well, you know, now we know, and we try to take steps towards this, and we try to regulate industry and regulate pollution. Is it really such a big deal anymore? And the answer is yes. We still see. Now this is the 1952 in London, and we still see those days in all the major cities in the world. London is still one of the Western world's most polluted cities. And of course, now we're getting data out of China showing 4, 5, 6 times higher air pollution levels than we see in what we thought were poorly polluted countries or cities and countries such as London and Brussels and New York. So, is it still a problem when it comes to death? WHO came out with a thing called the burden of disease, and it was the 20 leading risk factors globally for disease, mortality, and morbidity. And as you can see, indoor air pollution is number 3 on the list of overall killers in the world. And outdoor pollution is at number 7. And the thing that surprised people, I think, because in all these other, like News Valley and London and whatnot, there had been such a focus on respiratory disease because we assumed, well, we inhale it, so it's going to affect the lungs most of all. But if you see, the top bar in both of them are cardiovascular and circulatory disease. And this has led to us focusing primarily on trying to learn more about cardiovascular effects of air pollution. Now, air pollution is a very complex mixture of both particulate matter and gases. It has varying sizes of these particles, ranging from a coarse fraction, which kind of stays in the nose and the upper respiratory area, to fine particles and ultrafine particles that get further and further down into the lungs. And there is evidence now starting to come out that the ultrafine particles can translocate through the lungs so that they have systemic effects as well. Not only is particulate matter made up of the carbon core, but diesel particles in themselves, when they combust, have quite a bit of organic compounds on the surface. Now, these are comprised of anything from metals to PAHs, carcinogenic compounds. So one of the big questions now is it the actual particle that's causing it, or is it all this stuff that gathers it on the outside of it? And WHO came out and had looked at all the literature and decided that they saw the biggest risk was with this. The smaller the particles were, the more both respiratory and cardiovascular effects they were giving. So what are the health effects that have been proven without a doubt on air pollution now? Well, infant mortality is one that's been very alarming and has come more and more into perspective. Lung growth in children is stunted in areas. You see it in London, you see it in LA, you see it in Mexico City. But you also see it in rural areas because the air pollution does travel. Not only do you see the development of asthma in children, but you also see later on in life worsening of asthma. And if you have high enough air pollution days, you do see death from asthma. Same with COPD. COPD, not only have they shown the development of COPD, but also worsening of symptoms and at some points hospitalization and death because of high air pollution. You see increased airway infections. And on the heart side, you see the development of cardiovascular disease. You see plaque development in the arteries. You see myocardial infarctions, strokes, arrhythmias, have all been proven to be associated with peaks of air pollution. But when it comes to both the development of cardiovascular disease and development of respiratory diseases, it is a long-term chronic effect of being in air pollution all the time. And there is no level that has been found that's low enough that it, in a chronic exposure environment, doesn't give the development of this. So when politicians ask us, well, what's the lowest level we can strive for? We haven't found it yet, not for the chronic things. So not only does the environmental aspect of it, but there are political, biotechnological, and obviously the health effects are all really driving us to find a renewable energy source, which kind of everybody's looking at as a stopgap solution, because we're too far out to be saying everything's going to be electric and nothing's going to have emissions within 10 years, so we need that step in between. So the question is, from all these perspectives, what do we go with? What do we choose as our option? We have bioalcohols that have come out. Bioethanol was a big contender for a long time. The U.S. was one of the driving forces in bioethanol. Brazil has done a brilliant job of replacing most of their fleet of cars to run on bioethanol. However, there's so many problems with production. You have to use a lot of crop area. You have to use food resources. So it's been problematic. So it's starting to go away and starting not to become an option. Biogas is an emerging field. It's come very quickly in the last 2-3 years, but they do have problems with storage and transportation of biogas. So the big one has always been biodiesel now, within the past few years. It's been the one that the EU has gone for, and it's been the one that China chose. So those two markets kind of drove the global market to look more seriously at biodiesel. And one of the things that drove biodiesel the last few years into becoming this global leader in biofuels was because they moved on from a first generation, which is mostly made from animal fats, vegetable oils, and plant oils. They did move kind of quickly through a second generation with grasses, seeds, and waste that they could use. But their biggest step was that they went into a third generation, which is, at this point, dominated by microalgae. Some bacteria and yeasts are used, but mostly microalgae that can produce biodiesel, and then when you've extracted the biofuel from them, you can use them as fertilizer from what's left over. So when we think about problems in the environment and what we need to work on and what we need to use biofuels for, we think of that. And we think if we get everybody to use hybrids and do their best and use good biofuels for the environment, that's going to be the big solution. But that is what we should be working on. This is where most of our air pollution comes from. And it is the most problematic market to solve. Jet fuel has been very difficult because of pressurizations and mostly temperature, because biofuels don't react well with lower temperatures. However, BP has, within the last 3 months, come out with a biodiesel solution for jet fuel, and are looking towards the end of the year to be using, I think it's Southwest, and I think it's JetBlue, that are going to be using 100% biofuel in their fleet. So that's a huge step forward. Trucking industry has been slow, but that's been a huge part of that has been that there aren't any places to stop and fuel. Shipping industry is a huge problem when it comes to air pollution. So that is a production limitation that we need to work on. So in light of that, we need to work on the biotechnology side of this. There have been quite a few new developments. And here you see a microalgae farm where they grow. And it takes up quite a bit of land still. They can use land that's not available for anything else. So since they don't have to use the soil, it could be pretty dry environments where you're not going to be using it to grow anything else or have animal stock. But it still takes up a lot of land. So they've started developing PVC tubes and then these like sheets so the sunlight can flow through them, and they can get as much out of these as this farm, but with hanging environments. They can also now start growing, this is a waste plant. So they take wastewater, they add bacteria, and they get the microalgae to grow in. So you're kind of using two industrial compounds together, which is an option. There have been quite a few regulations and goals. Some of them are very set and very clear, and others, like the US, keep changing them almost every 3 or 4 months, because one of the groups that's in charge is the EPA, and they keep coming out with small adjustments to, oh wait, we're not going with bioethanol, we're going with biodiesel, what does that mean? So they are continually changing their regulations. The EU has actually been one of the clearest with their 2020 aim to have 10% of all transport fuel come from renewable sources. Now, some countries are well on target, and other countries are miles away from getting this done. So it's a big challenge to kind of help everybody get to the same point. Sweden, where we are, already has a mandatory 5% biodiesel in every diesel sold. Some gas stations are up to 30%. So we are well within our regulations there. And you see the years are about the same, 2020, 2022. These are kind of that turning point right around that time. However, the IPCC came out and had the toughest goals yet. And they said that they want 80% renewable target by 2050, which is, if you've seen how the market's grown and how slowly it's been catching up with this, that is a very ambitious goal. So our group has been looking at both biodiesel, or both diesel and gas mixtures for many, many years. And there are a number of ways to do this. Epidemiological studies, you could do cell-free or in vitro cell-based models. You could use animal models. Our main source is human experimental models. We do have many collaborations with epidemiologists and animal and in vitro work, but we tend to focus on human experimental models. And these are just some of the air pollutants that we've worked on earlier. So one of the reasons that we can do our human work is because we have a chamber built up for this. So we tend to do 1 hour exposures in the chamber. We do 15 minutes of interval of exercise and 15 minutes of rest. And this is so that we know that they inhale into their lungs. They do tests before so that we know they have a certain ventilation rate when they're biking, so it's standardized. This is our engine. And then this pipe goes into the chamber. So about 10% of the exhaust goes into the chamber, which is mixed with filtered air, and then we shunt away about 90%. So we usually have a concentration of about 300 micrograms per cubic meter, which is roughly a bad day in London. We use the European urban transient cycle, which means that our engine kind of goes up and down so that it's like go and stop and go of regular urban traffic, which gives it more of a real world environment as opposed to just having an idling engine going. So we had looked at diesel for all these years and we get very consistent results. And so we were thinking, well, one of the things that we got approached was by the politicians in Sweden saying, are we going for the right thing? Everybody's been looking at biotechnology. They've been looking at environmental impacts. They've been looking at characteristics of the fuels. But nobody was asking themselves, is this a health benefit to change to this fuel? So they were asking us, is this really a good choice for us to put our investment into? So we designed 2 studies for cardiovascular effects. One was with an Army 30 blend, so a 30% Army and 70% diesel blend, which is the highest that's found in the market in Sweden now. And Army is made from rapeseed oil, and the most commonly sold biodiesel in the EU. But we also wanted to look towards the future, and would it be possible to, or what would be the effects when we get around to replacing diesel with Army. So we also did a study with Army 100, which is a pure Army. So for the first one, we had 16 healthy non-smoking subjects. We did our usual 300 micrograms per cubic meter for both Army 30 and diesel. We kind of did it based on mass concentration. However, that was kind of because we were thinking, well, it's still quite a lot of diesel in it, so that would make sense. But Army 100, we wanted to see what happens to the characterization of what comes out of the tailpipe. So there we did similar running conditions. So we had the diesel at 300, and then we just let the similar running conditions, and the Army 100 would be what it was. We've used quite a bit of cardiovascular tools for investigating it. We use arterial stiffness. We use the gold standard for looking at endothelial dysfunction, which is the forearm plethysmography. We look at blood. We do EKGs. We have something called the Batman chamber, which is an ex vivo technique, and we also look at blood pressure. And this is just a little chart to show what we've seen in diesel. And the acute effects of diesel actually are surprisingly quick. When it comes to blood pressure and heart rate variability, you can kind of understand that it comes quickly, but one thing that is surprising is that both heart attacks and strokes come within the first hour of air pollution peaks in real world exposures, which is really quick for the body to be responding to this overload on the system. But we also see stuff that comes later, which is usually blood clot formations, and then we see systemic inflammatory responses in the blood much later. So our big question was, would replacing diesel mitigate the acute adverse effects following an exposure? And our previous studies of diesel exhaust have shown really robust and reproducible results. So both when it comes to endothelial dysfunction, and we have 2 studies that show 2 to 6 hours post-exposure that you get blood clot formation. So one of the things that we're most interested in is the endothelial lining, which is the inner lining of the blood vessel, because when this gets an injury, it has several pathways that can affect us in many different ways. It can affect blood pressure, it can cause plaque ruptures, it can cause changes in blood pressure, all of which can, if you have underlying heart disease, be the reason why you're getting that stroke or that heart attack. So this is just to show you arterial stiffness is one way we look, and it's a non-invasive method where we look at the probe on the wrist, and then we can also look at an endothelial dysfunction by putting a arterial needle in, and we can use the arm as a local test for, we use 4 different kinds of vasodilators in order to see how the blood vessels respond to this. You can see this is the control arm, and this is how the arm is responding to the vasodilators. And one thing that we see with diesel has been that the blood vessels can't respond to these vasodilators, so we get a much bigger blunted effect, which shows us that there's endothelial dysfunction. This is just quickly the Badman chamber. It is actually, we can use healthy volunteers who've been exposed, and then we run their blood through these strips of pig aorta, and they'll show us thrombus formation. So we can see, does it give more clots? And as you can see in the air, it kind of, these represent damaged vessels. So it does give a little bit of a clot, but diesel definitely gives a acute clotting situation. So the results, as you can see, we get the exact same cardiovascular effects from RME30 as we do for diesel. This is the forearm plethysmography, so we get endothelial dysfunction. And this is a thrombus formation, so we get the same amount of thrombus formation, which, you know, we could kind of think, well, you know, yet again, this is a 30% blend, it's still got 70% diesel in it, so, but what really surprised us is that we get the exact same cardiovascular effects when we use RME 100. Even more tightly associated. So we started looking at, well, everybody says their lower PM emissions from RME 30 and from RME 100. So what is causing these cardiovascular, what is driving these cardiovascular effects? Not surprising, I mean, we standardized for 300 there. There's a little bit more NOx in the RME 30. And they say there's a reduction in PAHs. There is to a certain degree, but not as much as we thought we would see. The PAHs were the components on one of the components that surrounds the carbon core, which is known to give quite a few toxic and carcinogenic effects. But the interesting thing was the RME 100. We saw, well, we're getting half the PM emissions, which is what everybody says. But when we started looking at the particle number, that's when we started thinking, well, something's still going on here with the particles coming out. So we did a characterization on the particle size, and we see a dramatic shift. So biodiesel particles are mostly nanoparticles. So they're in the nanoparticle range, getting very far down into the lungs and have much more of an opportunity to translocate. We also saw an increase in metals on the particles. And biodiesel has been shown to be very corrosive, but this is showing us most of these are found in components in the motor, which means that it's so corrosive that it's corroding as it's traveling through the motor. So then we went on to look at, so this intrigued us. We kind of thought, you know, lower PM, it probably will have lower cardiovascular effects. So this really intrigued us. When we looked at diesel, just pure diesel, we've seen a number of pulmonary effects with a great deal of inflammatory cells that come into the lung. So what we did here was we took 15 subjects, put them in the chamber. We did RME 100, and we did it like we did in the other experiment that it had a similar running condition. But here we did it against filtered air because we wanted to see the increase of inflammation from air. We did a bronchoscopy at 6 hours post-exposure, where we did we collected bronchial wash ball and biopsies. And here you can just see the technique where we get cell counts in bronchial wash and ball, and there's a little biopsy that we take and the staining for it. So to summarize what we saw in the pulmonary effects, we saw that both in the bronchial mucosa and the bronchial wash, we got an inflammation just like we see in diesel. We did see a bronchial wash macrophage response, which is completely new. We don't see that in diesel. And it kind of, this combined with that we saw a submucosal eosinophil increase might lead us to believe that biodiesel is actually slightly more toxic for the lungs than diesel is. And since we have the increase in submucosal eosinophils, it might actually be worse for asthmatics and COPD patients who already have that eosinophil drive. So our conclusions of this was that the exposure to the RME biodiesel exhaust has comparable adverse respiratory and cardiovascular effects, despite seeing a varying composition on the surface and a varying particle reactivity. And that it's really, we need to be very cautious and talk to the politicians and the policymakers who are steering and guiding where the multi-billion industry of developing the next biofuel, that they need to take into consideration these health effects. Because as much as we want to come out with a biofuel that's good for the environment, we don't want to be coming out with something that's even worse for our health than what we have today. So I just want to thank all my collaborators in Scotland, the UK, Netherlands, and Umeå, Stockholm. These are large studies and large undertakings, so it takes a lot of
Well, thank you, Dr. Bosson, for that elegant presentation. Are there any questions for Dr. Bosson?
I was intrigued by the eosinophil profile with the biodiesel. Did you see any IgE response? Is it actually delivering some antigen to trigger this eosinophil?
We've not looked at IgE yet. These are really preliminary results. We've actually just started looking at the inflammatory cells, and when we saw those, we started thinking about, because we have more bronchial wash and ball and biopsies, so the next step is to start looking, and we have more blood samples and stuff like that. So we do want to look for other markers to see what kind of activation markers we can see as well. Because that intrigue, we were not expecting the eosinophil response. It was kind of, because we've been doing diesel for so long and never seen any response like that. So. And it's not I wouldn't say it's a huge response, but it's a significant response. So it's not like they're spiking.
Any other questions? I have a quick question. This is time. How do you get ethical approval for invasive studies on healthy volunteers? We've got problems just getting ethical approvals, just studying proper studies and proper medicines in patients.
Well, we're lucky that we have a strong group both in Scotland and Sweden. We've done probably 3,000-4,000 of these combined, of these plethysmography and stuff, without seeing adverse effects. We've been doing our chamber for about 30 years with different gases and diesel effects. So our ethical committee trusts us quite a bit since we have shown, we do have a track record of being very cautious and not seeing adverse effects. The one thing is that we do use healthy volunteers. We have done a couple studies with heart patients where we did see ST drops while they were biking, and that took a lot of committee like speeches back and forth to get to use heart attack patients, but they are pretty lenient on our healthy volunteers for what we want to do.
So no fatalities so far.
No fatalities, thank you.
Okay. Well, you said about biodegradable fuels here, biofuels, and clearly from your experience, experiments you've shown here that are no better, perhaps it's worse than.
Yeah, it's early days. This is the first study.
Okay, so assuming that holds, where do you go then?
Well, one of the things that we want to look at is since new generations of biodiesel are coming out, we've used the most common one on the market. The next step would be to maybe do microalgae, or at least characterization of microalgae biodiesel, and see if it burns in the same way. If it also has a nanoparticle composition, then biogas is an intriguing new development, and I think it would be, it would be worth looking at because the shipping industry is getting more and more interested in biogas. So it could be a new big.
It's also an issue economics, isn't it?
It is. It is.
Expensive fuel, nobody wants it.